Fantastic. I know we had over 500 credit union leaders, practitioners that registered. So I imagine there'll be a couple hundred folks here live. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to get started. We got a packed agenda. This is one of our favorite formats of events we do here at Rivial. And we do this every single year. We partner with the NCUA to bring on RISOs and other examiners from the NCUA to talk about upcoming exams, previous exams, and everything in between. So we'll do some introductions here. Today's panel, I got two RISOs with me today, but I'll start out with some introductions and some openings. My name is Taylor Wells. I'm the head of marketing here at Rivial, and I joke that I'm the least qualified person to give you advice, but I'm here moderating, and hopefully we can facilitate a great event for you. This will be recorded, and we will send out the recording afterwards. So if you want to share it with your team, and we'll send that out afterwards. And so yeah, let's do some introductions. Charles, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Taylor. Um, my name's Charles. I've been a RISO for, quite a while. I've been with NCUA for about 27 years now. And I remember, way back when I worked at a credit union, we were dealing with Y2K. So seen a lot of change over the course of my career. Yeah, so that's, I think, pretty much all I have to say. I'll hand it over to Murray.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Murray Boyd, another regional information systems officer with NCUA. I started with NCUA, I believe it was 2006, and was with the agency for several years. I had left the agency and went to go work for a credit union for many years, and then came back to the agency. So been back on board for a while now, and back in my old position as a RISO. And so it's good to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Murray. And it looks like we're getting a little bit of an echo, some of the folks in the audience. So if you just don't mind muting yourself, Charles and Murray, when you're not speaking, that'd be great. And that way we don't get any echo. Hopefully that solves it. And I love folks are already in the chat. So if you have questions, please throw them in the chat, throw them in the Q&A. I know with these other previous panels, the examiners may not feel comfortable answering every single question live, but I'll try to answer them and field them as they come up. And so feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A as we go through this agenda. So we're going to be covering a bunch of different areas. We'll be first covering kind of key issues from 2025 and kind of most common deficiencies that you all have seen. And then we'll go into kind of 2026 looking at main focus areas, and then even kind of go through asset size and talking through the different things you're seeing from asset size and all that fun stuff. So yeah, I'll start with the first question here, which is kind of looking at 2025 and what were the common either deficiencies or kind of key issues you all saw with exams in 2025? And I'll start with you, Murray.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the common areas that I kept experiencing or seeing as far as an issue with the credit unions I was going into was managing their incident response program, and mostly dealing with the vendor side of that response program. And so as credit unions establish their relationship with their vendors and they have vendors that are rated either critical or high because they either touch member information or have access to member information. What wasn't in place was a strong incident response process, and that would align with the credit union's incident response program. And so typically that's a weakness or an area for potential problems if the vendor experiences a breach or member information is compromised on the vendor side, what the expectations are to manage that breach, notify the credit union, and work together with the credit union to manage that issue. And so that's one of the areas that I was running into quite a bit. So the incident response plan or program is well established on the credit union side. It's just managing it in relation to the vendors that they were working with. And so that's an area that I continually look at, and we're seeing an issue quite often with that. And so with that, where does the liability lie? What's the expectation? Is it mentioned contractually in the contract with that vendor to notify the credit union and manage those expectations? That was an area that I would focus on for 2025. I'll pass it over to Charles.
Hey, Murray. I would say within the Western region, the access controls were were probably the top of the list. When we look at the Verizon data breach report, it kind of substantiates what or is in alignment with what we saw. One of the major failure points was insufficient MFA deployment, especially in cloud environments. That is an area that I think really stuck out a lot. The other thing is, we can all agree that we don't want to be a victim of a ransomware attack. I mean, that's just they say it's not a good credit union day, and I think I would rather correct myself and say it's not a good credit union year. Okay, when something like that happens, and I certainly don't want to be the last examiner on site when there is something like that. And we know, based on various research and everything, 80 to 90% of ransomware attacks use PowerShell. And so, when I come in and I see PowerShell in full language mode rather than constrained language mode, well, we'll have a talk about that. But it's more than just constrained language mode that we really, would like to see. It's script allow listing that only authorized scripts, PowerShell scripts, can run the environment. And those scripts are digitally signed and appropriately, activity is logged in there. And even beyond that is perhaps even just enough admin, which is another feature of PowerShell. So by locking down PowerShell, we're going to make it that much harder for an adversary to do that. Okay, because that's, it's one of the major tools that they're going to use to do all sorts of things that we don't want to see happen. So PowerShell, I think, is definitely one. The other thing I think too is application allow listing. All right, I mean the number of threats that are continuously evolving, especially with the use of AI and AI's ability to identify vulnerabilities, to write explicit exploit code for those particular vulnerabilities and really advance zero-day threats, it just makes sense to deploy some type of application allow listing where only those applications, and I would add scripts when we talk about PowerShell, can run in the environment. Anything else is no go. It's not going to work. Okay. These things like that, coupled with MFA, I think really are extremely valuable in reducing the attack surface. And that's one of the primary focuses that we want to see. What are we doing to reduce the attack surface? So I think those are some of the key things. Ancillary that doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, in the industry is firmware and firmware management. Okay. Because you can have the best controls at the OS level and above. Okay, you can have the best antivirus, you can do all sorts of great things, but if the firmware is compromised and way firmware is put together, the supply chain risk is, I think, significant. So what does that look like? I think it really looks like making sure you know what you have, but even going beyond that, and this is a very mature level, okay, is really understanding what firmware you have. Each firmware instance is hashed and compared to a good known hash from the manufacturer, okay? Because if something happens and that firmware is tampered, the entire security stack can be compromised. So, that's definitely something to consider going forward, I think. Because, the threats are just getting, and the exploits are just getting way more sophisticated now, especially with the use of AI. So again, what we're seeing, access controls, insufficient MFA deployment, figured cloud services, especially around Microsoft 365. I see security scores all over the range from 29 to 98. And really the key here, I think, is to go into each recommendation, say, hey, are we going to do this? Or we're going to risk accept this? Okay. And also looking at purview too, because that tends to be your data leakage protection, and looking at those recommended controls, and also Entra. There's a score there too. Each score is going to be unique to the institution, but at least to know and going through each one of those recommendations and saying, hey, we're going to risk accept this, or we're going to do it, or it's done, where your score should be, and then periodically monitoring that to make sure you're not falling out of an appropriate range. I think so. Those are some of the things that we, typically see and talk about during exams. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to you, Taylor.
Thanks, Charles. Great insight, Murray and Charles. I really appreciate it. And it looks like we got some questions that came in that I think are applicable that we can address real quick. Phil asked a question. He was curious What size credit unions did you execute examinations on in 2025? What was the typical environments you were working in?
Murray,
It was all across the spectrum from as small as $50 million in asset size all the way up to 13 billion in asset size. So we covered the gamut there in the asset size of credit unions that we would look at. And so each category, if you want to call it, has their challenges. Of course, with the smaller credit unions lacking the skill set and the resources to be able to implement proper solutions is a challenge. And you work with them to try to find adequate solutions for them. Whereas if you're in a $10 billion credit union, that's not the issue. It's more so the processes and looking at the solutions that are in place and diving deep into some of the configurations like access controls, like Charles had mentioned. And so, um, yeah, we've covered the gamut on that, and yeah, each presents their own unique challenge. As they get larger in size, asset size, and they become more sophisticated in the systems that they have, the services that they offer. And so that kind of entails a new, unique skill set to be able to evaluate that properly to make sure their security posture is adequate for what they're doing. Charles, do you want to add to that?
yeah, I think, in Western region, we tend to have larger institutions. And so, although, I go into a lot of institutions, so I look at the asset size, but if you ask me what institutions and asset size ranges have I been in, I've been in so many I can't even remember. And, but I think, the most important thing, and this kind of maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the most important thing, and irrespective of asset size, I think is having the most mature risk assessment methodology and process possible. Because if we need to really understand what we're up against, okay, and having that process in place, having a mature risk assessment process in place is really foundational. Okay, that is the key. And there's a lot of different ways to do risk. Again, when we come in, we can advance, things that we'd like to see or best practices or things like that. But we realize too, not everybody is going to have the resources or potentially the ability at that point to implement certain technologies. And so risk is something that we really look for. In other words, okay, not if we want to do something but we can't quite do it yet, okay, we're going to prepare some kind of document that says, hey, this is the issue. These are our compensating controls. We're going to review this in a certain period of time, okay, and we're going to get appropriate stakeholder sign off, okay. Now, I want to emphasize, the board is accountable, okay, and accountability cannot be delegated. So when we do a risk acceptance, we really need to make sure that there is some type of board acceptance of that risk acceptance, okay? That the board is informed. The board can delegate responsibilities, but they can't delegate accountability. And so we want to make sure that any type of risk acceptance is communicated to the board, okay? I think that's really important. And again, doing go and no go risk assessments, I think is a really good thing to be doing, and having a risk register. Okay. But the more advanced, and the more aligned with best practice methodologies that an institution has, I think the better off they're going to be as far as that goes. There's a really good book out there. I have it right here, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. I really recommend, I'm not supposed to recommend anything, and it's not an endorsement for or against, but I've read it. I think it's really good. Okay. Because if you can quantify the risk that you have, okay, then you can make appropriate investment decisions. It's impossible to eliminate risk 100%. Okay, it's just not going to happen. But by choosing the investments that have the greatest impact in risk reduction, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's certainly something that's a lot easier to sell to those who sign checks. So I think I think, advice to any asset size, that's it. Get a risk assessment methodology as mature as possible. Something else, but I think that I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Taylor. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, thanks. I know we were talking offline because I know cyber risk management, risk quantification is near and dear to our hearts, and we do a lot of work in that space. I see some of our clients in the chat talking about it. But I did want to take it over to Murray. I know this whole area of cyber risk assessments, risk quantification. Anything to add? Any perspective you have in that area? As I know, obviously it's yeah, Charles.
It's the same framework, following along those same lines of establishing a strong risk assessment. It's the roadmap to how you implement your security controls. And one of the things that we emphasize is making sure that we're putting security and performance over any budget cycles that you go through. And we encounter that quite a bit. We understand there's budget constraints in every institution, but it's being able to properly evaluate the risk and implement the controls and emphasize the need for that as opposed to letting the budget dictate how many of these teams operate. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge depending on the management that you have and people that you're working with. But certainly having a strong risk assessment to be able to express that correctly to management. And one of the things that we love to see, at least I love to see, is when they can put together a risk assessment and express the risk in terms of dollars. And that's always a great way of communicating the information to the executive team, to the board of directors, and saying, listen, this area, it's a high risk, and the potential for something to go wrong, this could be the impact. Could be $1 million, could be $10 million. And expressing it in a form of a dollar amount really gets people's attention. But certainly putting together the risk assessments, and you hear that all the time and all over the place. Risk assessments for not just IT, but we're looking at lending and BSA, and there's so many areas of within the operations of the credit union that examiners come in and say, what's your risk assessment look like? But more importantly, with IT, I think that sets the foundation for what your controls are going to look like and your ability to manage those risks. That's what I have to add to that. I'll
Right.
give it back to Taylor. I was looking at the comments over here and I saw some people asking some things on AI and
Yeah.
other things, but I'll let you lead this dance and you kind of tell
Thanks,
us what
Murray.
you want us to
Yeah.
end.
I love it. Appreciate that. Yeah. So yeah, let's get back into some of the questions because we do have a couple here. On that AI risk assessment, I will put it in. We'll follow up. We do a free cyber risk assessment that uses quantitative metrics that we'll send out to you all after the fact if you're interested in see how Reveal does it and how we work with credit unions like yours. So a little plug there for everyone. But cool, let's get back to some of the questions on in the chat because we do have some great questions here. I'm going to go back to Rob. Rob asked about MFA. Can you elaborate on what you're looking for MFA? Is that only for remote access and server management, or are you also expecting to see MFA at the desktop computer level for computers and use exclusively internal? And since Charles, that was your point on the MFA, I'll start with you. Any thoughts on the MFA or
No.
on that question?
Yeah. So, especially in cloud environments, in Microsoft 365, the recommended controls are for MFA for everyone, irrespective of where that person is. Okay. And that kind of leads into cloud access, CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, and that functionality. Because I think one of the challenges is shadow IT. Okay. That's definitely an area that can cause a lot of problems, and especially now with individuals going out potentially if there's no breaks or checks to whatever AI tools that are readily available anywhere. Okay, but definitely MFA within a cloud environment. I think from a risk assessment perspective, at a very minimum, admins within the network should have some type of MFA. That's what we typically like to see. It's kind of a gray area when it comes to network and local access as far as that goes. I think it's more of your risk tolerance and what you're willing to take on. Again, I'm very risk adverse, so I'd love to see MFA everywhere. But I definitely think around any privileged user in Active Directory should have some type of MFA. It's one of the strong recommendations for PowerShell that any script that's run has an MFA factor in it. Okay, so who's going to run PowerShell? It's going to be admins. Okay, so that's an area I think that's really, really important. Would it be nice to see everybody? But yeah, sometimes if you have a low risk asset, maybe you don't. Okay, but I think it's really a risk determination case by case, depending on, a lot of the context of it. But identity access management is definitely something I think that's really important. Okay. We might even talk about, privilege access management solution. Okay. I have a lot greater confidence if an admin password is changing every 24 hours. Okay. And we're using application allow listing and script allow listing, and our cloud environment has MFA, than if those things are missing. Okay. So I think there's trade-offs and operational trade-offs that will, constantly have to be made. But I think, if you have a baseline recommendation and you choose to not implement that baseline recommendation, then I think some type of risk acceptance document, okay, is appropriate. That's appropriately signed by key stakeholders, okay, and the outline for, hey, why are we doing what we're doing? Okay. Why is it important? Well, if a key individual leaves, hey, we have some history here. Why did we do this? Okay. And what was the rationale at the time? And maybe something has changed, and maybe there's a newer technology now that we can address this area. So I think those are some of the key takeaways. So anyway, I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Taylor.
Thanks, Charles. Murray, any additional insights on the MFA?
Charles said it well. He covered a lot of good things there, and certainly looking at the solutions that are available out there, identity access management, some PAMs, privileged access management solutions. Comes down to access controls, comes down to developing a risk assessment that tells you where those threat vectors lie. And even going further into it is looking at and mapping your data points. Where does your data lie within the institution? And mapping that out. But again, this if I can back up a minute, because it really is contingent on the institution. I don't want to say the asset size, but the systems that they have, the services they provide. And I don't want to say asset size, but it does. You go to the smaller institutions, you're looking at maybe one branch, maybe 2 or 3 branches at most. And so they're all located geographically close to each other. They're in the same town. And that requires, I think, a different approach versus a very large institution that's spread across several states and are very geographically diverse. So as you get into those more sophisticated institutions, certainly zero trust is still a viable solution. And doing zero trust and access controls becomes more critical. And so there's so many solutions out there. Of course, we can't endorse any particular one, but many people have listed some well-known ones here in the chat that I'm looking at. But certainly looking at the PAMs or the IAMs, and it comes down to maintaining that control. But how do you do that, and what's the approach? And you've got to map your data points and map where your data lies, the critical data, and who has access to that data, and what solutions you put surrounding that data. Certainly, zero trust is always a viable solution, starting there and implementing the other access controls. You're going to have MFA, the more critical systems. You can put in PAMs. And going back to the other side of the spectrum, let's say with the smaller institutions, right? What can they do? Not having the resources for those high-level solutions, well, it starts with strong internal controls. And so looking at how the systems are initially set up, their core system and just their basic network, who is set up on, are the employees set up correctly in that system? Do they have the right privileges to access only the information they need to access? And oftentimes that comes down to internal controls, because are they reviewing that on a regular basis? Let's say annually, as employees come and leave the institution, is this access list updated on a regular basis? And so just even something as basic as that can definitely help improve security, because they're removing accounts that are no longer used, that are no longer just lingering out there for the core system or for other systems on the network. So again, it is a varying degree, but it comes down to looking at access controls is the bottom line. I guess that's my 2 cents to add to what Charles was.
I love it. Super great. We do have a bunch of great more questions to address, and we'll hit AI. We'll hit some other things as well here in a second. But Nico did have another follow-up question for the MFA. He's curious, does the NCUA differentiate between phishing-resistant MFA versus non-resistant MFA? Charles or Murray, do any of you have any insight on that?
Any MFA is better than none. Okay. So I think, we just look at the context of where that MFA is deployed, how it's deployed. Again, it's all in context. What assets are we, protecting? Who's using it? Who's not? Certainly, we all agree, we all get around behind that SMS texting isn't really where it's at anymore. Okay. So, again, there's no one particular right answer for that. I think it's really based on your risk assessments. And, I want to add one other thing I think is really important here is that, the institutions I've gone into and where I really have nothing to write up, okay, those institutions tend to leverage research resources, okay? And I really can't mention any vendor names, but they tend to leverage organizations that do research, technical research, and read their technical guidance publications and chat with these and meet with these specialists who are engaged in research for any particular issue that they're tackling with. Okay. This is a real key differentiator that I personally see, that if an organization's tapping into some type of research body, I think they're going to do better. And we're living in a world of hyper novelty now. Of my generation, we saw the personal computer, then the internet, then social media, and now AI. Okay. It's impossible for one organization to fully understand all of the potential risk profiles that are out there with respect to all the changes that are going on. So tapping into research, I think, is really foundational in the continued effort to enhance controls. Okay. So, I've had this conclusion for quite a while, and I thought, well, what do these smaller institutions do? Okay. Well, there's a great equalizer now. It's AI. Okay. And there's a lot of good information that, you can glean from that and help supplement some of this research. Okay. So I think, it's definitely, I would encourage, you really ask yourselves, are you tapped into some kind of research group that can help you with these, types of difficult or technical implementations, application allow listing, years ago when I was reading some technical guidance on that, there was a whole playbook on what to do and how to do it and everything like that. And, this is important. This is really important because if you start a process, okay, and then, upset a bunch of key stakeholders, okay, that process isn't going to go anywhere. Okay. It's going to be sunset. It's going to be sidelined. It's going to be put on the shelf. And yet, there would be something that could be potentially very beneficial to implement. So having that technical guidance on how to implement something and what to watch out for precludes you from having to trailblaze and reinvent the wheel. Okay. So I think that's the takeaway I have. All right. Back to you, team.
Thanks, Charles. Great insights. I'm loving it. And great, more questions we got coming in. So awesome. We'll try to address them all. And let's actually switch over to AI. We've been hinting at it. It's on everyone's mind. We have a community for credit union cybersecurity leaders, and we do monthly events where we have kind of off the record conversations. And a year ago, everyone was banning AI, right? Or just not allowing AI in their organization. That it's almost a business imperative to utilize AI to some extent. And they're starting to use Microsoft Copilot, and they're starting to integrate it more off with. And I know we had a question earlier on around AI. Is what are you seeing? Yeah, any guidance on how to manage AI? Recommend NIST. The AI RMF framework, or any sort of frameworks, any sort of guidance you have with AI of how to put governance controls in place. Murray, I'll start with you. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, absolutely leaning on those frameworks, NIST, CISA, those are essential. And I say that within our industry because I feel we've been a little slow to come up to speed with how we evaluate as an agency, NCUA, how we evaluate AI. And Charles is absolutely right. As RISOs, We need to go out, we need to do research, we need to learn these things to come in and be able to apply what we're learning on our own and evaluate how well credit unions are safeguarding members' information. And so, with that said, there's still the basics with AI. AI is going to require network permissions. It's going to require access to data. And so, what are the controls surrounding those touch points with AI? And it also depends on how AI is being used. There's so many different levels, and it's only going to get more integrated into almost every aspect of the operations as AI continues to mature. And so, right now, we're seeing a lot of vendor products laden with AI features. And so, how is that being vetted? How is that being evaluated by the IT team or the credit union to ensure that there's proper security controls around those products themselves? And that's just the vendor stuff. Now, with AI developed or implemented by the credit union, going back to those same safeguards, risk assessment, access controls, mapping the data points, the permissions to the networks. How is that AI being utilized? Are we providing the proper training to employees? What I've been seeing, and I think it's a great approach, of course, developing the risk assessment piece of it and proper policies and taking baby steps. And as they implement it, they're only opening it up to a certain segment of the staff at the credit union. They get them trained, they implement it, they see how that's working out before they start expanding a wider use of that AI feature, whatever that may be. And so it just goes back almost to the basics, but now we're focusing deep on AI. And if you start getting into specifics on how it's going to be utilized, then that tells you kind of the functionality that you're going to expect from that AI tool. So keeping it closed loop or internal to the organization only, then at what point are you going to open that up to large language models out on the web? And what risk does that pose to the institution? Yeah, going back to the basics, the risk assessments, analyzing the permissions and access controls surrounding those solutions. And so there's the AI that's being implemented by the credit union, focus on that. Then there's the AI-laden vendor tools that are, we have AI in this and that. And then so how's that being evaluated? So that's kind of my take on it. I'm not sure that anything to add, Charles. I mean, that there's a lot of things I could probably dive into, but I don't want to get too far into the weeds, and then it can take a lot of time.
Yep. That was great. I'll pass over to Charles for now. We can always loop back, especially if the folks that want to go in further into any of those questions. Murray, thank you. Charles, yeah, any thoughts on?
I'll just echo what Murray said, risk assessments, definitely, but also use cases, okay? Because there are various types of agents and solutions out there, and one particular agent might be really good for what you want to do, but not for another process. So it's really coming up with use cases. And just like in cloud computing too, where we want to look at, hey, what are the costs? Okay. What are the token costs for both prompts and output to us? Okay. Because that can get, if we're using the wrong, and the cost variances are interesting to look at. The cost between, I won't mention any vendor names, but one particular vendor versus another, and what token costs are all over the board. Okay, so what I see as a big challenge, if I put my vintage CISO's shoes or something, you have a third party vendor that just goes and plugs some type of AI solution in, and the use case isn't appropriately engineered to what needs to be done. And now the charges start racking up, okay? And maybe it's a critical vendor, and now what do you do? Where's your exit strategy? So I know in the risk management framework, in this risk management framework, it does have, it emphasizes risk exit strategies, okay? And you can, right now, from what I'm reading and things like that, implementation, about 80% of it's going to not go as we really want it to go. Okay, so there's a steep learning curve here, a lot of challenges, and there was a examiner that I used to work with in West Virginia, and he said if it grows too fast, it ain't good because only weeds grow fast. So you don't want to go too fast in this. Okay, take it slow and steady. That would be my recommendations on the AI.
Thanks, Charles. Great. Oh yeah, Murray, go ahead,
My apologies.
please.
If I can add to that, the wide use of AI, again, and I think that's going to be how do you get a handle around that as you begin to implement it in various aspects of the operations of the credit union. And so going back to what Charles said is the individual who's an expert in-house has done the research and can help manage that for the credit union. Because having to rely on a vendor, I think that really elevates your risk and being dependent on some vendor or third party to do that for you. And so if you're a large institution, then you have the resources and you train your people to become the experts in how to manage that well for the credit union. That is going to uh, the return on that investment is going to be tenfold. And so, again, we're talking just the various aspects because so many pieces to AI. It's hard to really answer that in like one question. But for instance, I'll give you an example. We're looking at also like the implementation now of SD-WANs, and those SD-WANs are carrying applications and data for the credit union that sometimes are routed differently, but they're routed smartly because of AI. And we have AI smart firewalls and network appliances that help with that SD-WAN. And that again, that's just one segment of the operations of the credit union. Who's managing that? Is it managed properly? Is it set up correctly? Then we got the AI being used for the call centers and their operations, right? We've got AI over in lending. We've got AI in the various different parts of the credit union. That's like how bringing it all together collectively. Who is the individual or team of individuals within the institution that can help manage that properly to implement the proper safeguards? And that's something you need to think about as an institution. Baby steps.
But yeah, that's great. I know Julio asks, are you using the U.S. Treasury's AI risk management framework, or is there another framework that you look at? Or yeah, any thoughts there? I'll start with you, Charles. Any thoughts on frameworks?
Well, I right now, what I particularly look for is, do we have some type of policy in place, okay, for the use of it? And ideally, we don't endorse any particular framework, okay? I think it's a good idea to have that it's a best practice to adopt a framework, but there's no specific frameworks that we will really say, hey, we're going to use this one or this one or what have you. So I think, the first thing, policies, and again, risk assessments. What are we doing, with risk? Do we understand what can go wrong? And what's the board's risk appetite? Okay. That's a key driver in all of this. So I think those are some of the things. So I think I'll stop there.
Cool. Murray, any additional thoughts on that as far as frameworks or any ones you're looking at that are super helpful? I think you're on mute. Yeah, that was my
Not
fault.
not necessarily. I haven't focused on any one framework. I just kind of been evaluating that on my own. Like I said, I think the agency has been slow to catch up and implement some kind of framework for properly evaluating that within uh, our exam work. And not to take away anything from that, because the foundation of what we do still applies in the basics. And it's, I think, what Charles was alluding to is, going back to policies, procedures, the risk assessment, that kind of thing. As far as the frameworks, not any that I've really focused on. I've just been more of a generalist. I mean, there's NIST and there's all these other places that people can go to for that information. Yeah, none. I don't have anything specific, I guess, for those frameworks.
Thanks, Murray. Awesome. Great advice. I know we only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to hit a couple more of these questions. Thanks, everyone, for the questions. Really great insights. Let's see here. We got Tyler asks, with the cap being sunsetted, what are your expectations for credit unions moving forward? Any thoughts on that, Charles?
Okay. So again, I think it's foundationally, it's our risk assessment. Okay. And a risk assessment is appropriately identifying the threats that are out there. It's assessing what's the likelihood and probability of those threats being executed. It's looking at the inherent risk. Okay. And then we're listing our controls that we have in place, and we're coming up with our residual list. Okay. That is the key. Okay, so for example, if I go in and look at a risk assessment and PowerShell as the controls over PowerShell isn't listed, we'll talk about that. Okay, I think really at this point, we know there is, the potential for Appendix A to go away and then move it into a letter to credit unions. But GLBA still stands, okay? To have the appropriate technical safeguards, governance to protect member data. That's really the key, okay? And how do you do that? Understanding the risks that are there. And I got to say, the one thing, that's kind of been in the back of my mind is, when we look at some of these latest stories about edge devices being attacked, okay, and really zero-day vulnerabilities identified. And I think, well, a couple of years ago, you never heard about this, okay? And I go, well, what's going on here? And is it? And I'm just posing a question. I can't say I know the answer to this, but is it something where AI is being used to identify vulnerabilities in these edge devices and code being written? We know that happened with the 11 agencies in the Mexican government, okay, where a group of hackers basically overrode the guardrails for Claude and identified vulnerabilities and had Claude write the exploitation code, okay, and exfiltrated like 150 gigabytes of data out of these 11 Mexican agencies. I think it would have been a lot harder to do, okay, if they had, certain controls in place like MFA, application allow listing, good patch management, okay, and underlying all of that is really, understanding your risk and a very mature risk assessment methodology. So, okay, back to you, Tyler.
Thanks, Murray. Any thoughts on that as far as any additional insights there?
No, not really.
Yeah, that's all good. Yeah, I know we've covered a lot already. So that's great. A couple other questions. Oh, go ahead, Murray. Yeah, please.
Well, the only thing I was going to mention is, we still, as far as frameworks, and obviously we're using the ACIP framework, and that's still something that's still being developed to catch up to a lot of the new technologies that are out there and evaluating, for instance, AI. And that's pretty much what I was going to mention.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for folks, I did put a couple more resources from Reveal on AI risk management and governance. We have a white paper and an assessment we put together because that's a bunch of work I know our founder Randy has put into AI risk management and AI governance as the challenges we're definitely facing all of how to manage all of that. Awesome. We do have a couple more questions here. Let's see here. I want to make sure I cover them all. We got a lot more coming in. This is an interesting one. Lee asks, CISOs are strong risk leaders that seem to be largely absent in small to medium credit unions. Just their personal perception. What is the reality? Do most CUs in this asset range typically have CISOs? How do you feel this will or won't impact AI adoption internally and in vendor management? So I think the question from Lee is specifically, your perception of like security leadership, especially in small credit unions. I know there's a lot of small credit unions, and any advice you'd have for either a virtual CISO or how to manage the absence of a CISO in a small credit union. Any thoughts there, if I'm understanding Lee's question correctly? I'll start with you, Murray, on that.
Yeah, certainly we're starting to see a lot more of those positions pop up and credit unions taking on CISOs. Definitely a large use of virtual CISOs, only because of the, I think, budgetary constraints that they face. They find that they get more value out of that as opposed to paying, I guess, someone full time. So either way, the use of a virtual CISO or having a CISO full time, definitely starting to see that, and I think that's a critical component as that their mindset changes and focusing more on the security aspect of driving their technology and having the proper security controls behind that. It was always there, but I think even more so now and in this day and age. And so seeing them adopt that is a great thing to see from our perspective, and to continue that implementation. So yeah, I think that we're just going to continue seeing more and more of that as all of these services are more technologically driven. They already are, but it'll just continue down that road into the future, and especially with the implementation of AI leading technologies.
Thanks, Murray.
Charles?
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I think, to Murray's point, we are definitely seeing more virtual CISOs, just for a lot of different factors. But, I mentioned it before, and I just reiterate again, is the importance of research. Okay. And traditionally, that's what, knowledge base of virtual CISO is brought in, potentially, if there was a knowledge vacuum there. Now with AI, that can be really augmented to help um, further strengthen internal controls and really provide some really good best practices that I think, so, the playing field, I think, is leveling out here, which is very interesting to watch. And, there is something to be said that, the more larger things are, the more complex things can get. Okay. Complexity by inherently is going to have more risk. Okay. And, when, when, if you bring a consultant in to an organization, typically their main purpose there is unwinding the complexity that has been created. Okay. And so, I think this is an area that I think it's really welcome to see that, a smaller institution now can not only tap a virtual CISO, but also have some resources into AI to begin to really achieve some world-class guidance, okay, on what to do and how to do it. Before that, it was pretty hefty price tag to buy into some type of research body or organization and get, pick their brains. Anyway, I'll pass it back to you, Taylor.
Thanks so much, Charles. I do want to finish up. I know there's some questions. We're not going to get to everyone's questions, sadly, but I do want to finish up because there was one last one in here. I think that's pretty relevant. David asked, any thoughts on where security should reside within the organization, and also what do you look for when you report to the board? So just curious, especially in larger credit unions, where does security reside, and then what do you report to the board? I'll start with you, Charles.
That's, again, it's depends on the context of it. Ideally, information security there, if you look at the FFIEC guidance, it's, the CISO should have the type of independence necessary to call the shots when it comes to security. Okay. I think it really depends on the culture of the organization. But I definitely think at the minimum, a dotted line for information security to an oversight committee that has a board member on it is foundational. Again, said the board is accountable, okay, and accountability cannot be delegated. Responsibilities can be. There's got to be a piece there. Now, I always ask, okay, you have this person and maybe they're reporting, maybe IT operations is reporting to the CIO and information security is reporting to the CIO. Okay. Well, who's writing that person? Who's writing the CISO's appraisal? Okay. And that's, because are you going to call out your boss that, hey, they're really screwing up? Okay. And that's why I think really that segregation, that CISO should have probably be ideally under enterprise risk management. But again, there are cases that could be made where, it's really good working relationship and information security is tight, working with IT. So, it really depends. But, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. And you can see in the results of either audits how effectively that is working. Okay. So I think that's really the key driver here. Okay.
Great advice, Charles. Murray, wrap us up here. I know we're about up on time. Any final thoughts for board reporting or security functions?
Absolutely. Just echoing what Charles has said, I think their independence needs to be there, and we're actually seeing a lot of that happen. And these past few exams that I've been on, individuals that are either CISOs or security officers have been moved away from under the CIO or the IT department and moved over either to like internal audit or risk management, and creating that independence between those two areas. And I think that's very important. So certainly I think that's a better way of structuring the organization and being able to have somebody independent of that team to go in and say, you guys need to do this or change these things from security perspective. and not have that influence, like Charles mentioned, from your boss, who might be the CIO. So definitely, I think that's a better structure. And with respect to reporting to the board, that comes down to the institution and the things that they're doing. I think a good overall summary of the IT's practices and what they're doing with the risk assessments, with testing, with training, and with the security controls that they've implemented within the credit union, all that needs to be summarized and provided and communicated to the board, at least on an annual basis, is our requirement that we often see that that's broken up over a period of time. It can be monthly, quarterly, however the credit union decides to do that, but that information is being communicated to the board. I think it's very important for several reasons. One, that CIO and the IT team get to toot their own horn and say, hey, look at all the great things that we're doing. But they also get to emphasize the importance of areas that may need development by saying, well, look, we've done testing. These were the results. We have maybe some security gaps here. Those can be filled by doing this. And all you're doing is raising awareness. But that awareness then becomes an idea that gets put into action, that gets implemented down the road. And so that consistent message to the board definitely helps that process. Keep in mind that it starts just with the basic reports, but I mean you can expand on that. One of the problems, though, I do see is the board and their ability to understand that information, and that goes back to one of the things I was saying. If they can translate that into dollar amounts and what that means to the board in terms of dollars and any risks that lie with high critical systems that can really have a negative impact on the credit union, and say this can cost us so many millions, really grabs people's attention when you have a board that's not too IT savvy. Either way, I think those are things you want to include in those reports to the board. But it's definitely important. Toot your own horn and put those important things that you want to help develop and improve the security posture of the credit union, put those out in those reports.
Murray, thank you so much. I know we're over time here, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Folks were asking about our community, so I put that in the chat too if you want to join and meet with other credit union cyber and risk leaders. But yeah, thank you, Murray. Thank you, Charles, for coming on. We really appreciate our partnership with NCUA, and we'll have to have you come back sooner than a year, because I think this was a great discussion. I learned a ton. The audience is super grateful. There's so many thank yous. Thank you for your insights. Yeah, Charles.
I just want to emphasize though,
Please.
Any mention of vendors is not an endorsement for or against. Okay, we want to make sure it's very clear on that one. Okay, all right.
Thanks, Charles.
But I appreciate the opportunity and meeting everybody, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Murray.
One last thing I do want to say is thank you for having us here. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone who attended. And I did see a lot of questions out there that I know we didn't get a chance to get around to. I'm certainly open if you want to provide my contact information and they want to reach out, that I can certainly help them look for the answers to their questions. And so I just wanted to put that out there. So sorry to those of you we didn't get to, but I know it's just a short amount of time and a lot of information, but thank you all.
Thank you, Murray. And it's very generous of you. And if you do want to connect with the panelists or connect with Murray, please reach out to us. You can respond to the recording email we send to you and just ask for an introduction, and we can connect you all. And so yeah, thanks again everyone for joining us. We'll send out the recording afterwards, and we really appreciate you taking the time. All the great questions made it a really fun event all around. And then once again, thanks Murray, thanks Charles, and thank you to the NCUA for partnering with us on this. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.